I want to speak on something this morning that God has actually been speaking to me about for quite a few months now, and something that I haven't yet actually mastered. And the thing that he's been speaking to me about is distraction. And he began speaking to me about it a while ago, and I recognized his voice. And some of the things that he was talking to me about was about that my head was always somewhere else. You know, distraction, all it is it's focusing on the thing that isn't meant to be the thing for right now. And it seems that that's how I spend a lot of my life. And so God began speaking to me about it, and I thought I was making good progress until a couple of months in, I was out having lunch with my husband, and as we're having lunch, he just said to me, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, why?" And he just said, "You know, these last few weeks, you've just seemed really distracted and not really present to me and the kids." And I was like, darn it, you know, I thought I was getting somewhere. And as I've tried to journey with God a bit, this whole thing about distraction, what I've noticed is I'm not the only one that struggles. I'm not the only one who struggles to focus on the thing that is the thing for right now as opposed to everything else. And I think when it comes to being a people who want to be open to the things of the Spirit, who want to be available to Him, used by Him, recognizing what the Spirit is doing in the moment and going with that. And I think we want that. I think that's why we're here. When it comes to being those kind of people, I think what stops us so often is not fear, ultimately. I think fear is part of it, but it's not ultimately fear. It's not sin or disobedience. Ultimately, I think it's that we get distracted, that the everyday normal stuff of our lives, and there's so much going on in our lives, those things are so at the forefront of our heads and our hearts that we take our eyes off it. And so that's what I want to talk about this morning, is about distraction and how can we learn to be free, to be a little less distracted and a bit more available to God. And when it comes to distraction, there's someone in the Bible that I think can really relate to us if we find ourselves in that place. And we read about her in Luke chapter 10, starting at verse 38. And it says this: as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, and just a really quick pause there, we're going to come back to that a little bit later, but Jesus and his disciples, they're on their way somewhere. They're actually on their way to Jerusalem, but while they're on their way, this thing happened. So they were on their way, and it says this: he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened up her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted in the message that says that she was pulled away by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." Thus proving that sibling whinging has been around for centuries. "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed. Indeed, only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her." So here is Martha. We'll come back in a moment to what Mary chose and why it was better. But here's Martha, and she's distracted. She heard that Jesus was going to be passing by, and she sensed an opportunity. And so she welcomes him. She invites him in. She opens up her home. What's happened, though, is that she's pulled away. And the thing that she's pulled away, in that culture, what would have been really normal is you open up your home to a guest. You don't just invite them around and give them a cup of tea. You host them. You feed them. That's part of your welcome. And who would have done that? The women. And so Martha's getting on with what ordinarily would have been her role, and a good role at that. It's good to welcome. It's good to cook. It's good to host. But she had invited Jesus in. Surely what she really wanted was to be with him, not to be pulled away by those things. And she can't manage that moment. She's pulled away. She is distracted. And Martha's problem is our problem. We get distracted. Our lives are busy. There is always something else that needs doing. There is always something else on the to-do list. And what we can often find is that even as we're doing one thing, our mind is being pulled away to the thing that maybe we actually should be doing. These things, they crowd in on us. And what happens is that in our distraction, we stop being present. Just like Joel said to me a few months ago, we stop being present to the people that we love. We stop being present and open to the Lord and what it is that he might want to do and say. We're pulled away. We're distracted. Every day, there's the distraction that happens to us. But as well, one thing I'm noticing is there is also the distraction that we choose. As weird as it sounds, there is the distraction that we actually go to, which is about constant company. It's about constantly being on our phones. It's about the next box set on Netflix. It's social media and the scrolling through. There's the distraction that we choose. And what's weird is like how much now these things are in our phone. And this is just one way that we distract ourselves. You know, some of you, because you're a little older like me, a few years ago, if I said to you, hey, I'm just nipping to the loo, let me just grab my phone, you would have gone, oh, that's a bit gross. But now we all do it. And we know that we all do it because on our social media, we're always seeing pictures of phones in rice where people have dropped their phone down the loo. A friend of mine was telling me that at Christmas this year, they had a big family gathering. They're all sitting around on Christmas afternoon playing games, as some families do. We just eat sweets and watch TV in hours. But, you know, they were all sitting around playing games. And as they were playing games, they were listening to music from her dad's phone on the Sonos sound system as they're playing. And then after a little while, her dad excuses himself and he nips to the toilet. But a couple of moments later, the music stops on the Sonos, and instead what comes through is the sound of Tetris, old school. And as he sits on the loo and plays Tetris, and they all know, we do this. We do this. And so what that means is that even when we are having a quick wee, we are taken away, we're distracted. We don't even have that moment to ourselves and to be free. We are distracted, and we often choose. We don't realize that we're choosing distraction, but we are. So I'll give you an example from my life. One of the ways when I've noticed, as the Lord's been beginning to speak to me about this, that I've noticed the distraction that I choose. So let's say, hypothetically, that I'm preparing a talk. And as I'm preparing this talk, I'm thinking, I think that I know that the Lord has something to say, and I think I know where this is going, and I'm going to do this bit here, and I'm going to speak on this bit there, and I'm feeling okay for a moment. But then suddenly, the fear rises up in me. Am I going to get it done in time? Is that story going to work there? Is this going to... And the fear starts rising up in me, and right at the moment when I should just pause and ask the Lord again, come and give me your peace, give me your clarity, what I've noticed is I pick up my phone to soothe that rising emotion, to soothe the fear, to distract me from the fear, and I start scrolling through Instagram or playing a mindless game. And I don't know what it is for you, but I know that you will have something in your life that isn't necessarily a bad thing, whether it's work or your emails or going to the gym or a box set. They're not necessarily bad things, but they're the things that we go to distract us when the tricky emotions rise up. When life just feels a bit full on, instead of bringing those things to the Lord, we choose to numb ourselves. There's the distraction that happens to us. There's the distraction that we pick up and that we choose. And what it means is we're not present. We're not available to the Lord. We're not listening to his voice, open to what it is that he wants to do. And a few months ago, I was heading to church one morning. I was actually going to be speaking. And so I said to Joel and the kids, well, I'm going to go to church just a bit ahead of you, just to make sure I'm ready. And as I was about to walk out of the door, my daughter, Esther, she's 7, she said, Mummy, if I put my trainers on now, can I come with you? And I had hoped to have those last few moments, the little walk to church, it's about 10 minutes, just to I was going to say pray. In all reality, it would have been to go over my talk again and to worry about it. But, I had hoped for those few moments to myself. But she wanted to come with me. And so I said, fine, okay, get your shoes on. So we're walking along. And even as we're walking together, I'm doing that thing. I'm just going over the talk. Is that bit going to work? All of that. And then I suddenly realized that Esther has been speaking to me and I've not been listening because I've been distracted. And so I honed on her voice. What was that, love? What were you saying? And she said, Mummy, I was just saying, it's actually really cold today, and I can really feel the cold on my ears. Where can you feel the cold, Mummy? And so I stopped thinking, and I just felt my body. I was aware of my body. And I began just to be aware of where the cold was hitting me. And I said to Esther, I can feel the cold on my cheekbones. And I can feel the cold on my fingers of this hand. But this hand is lovely and warm because it's holding your hand. And suddenly, Esther had pulled me out of distraction. And I was fully present to that moment. I was aware of my body. I was aware of my daughter, thankful for the gift that she is in my life. And what a difference that walk to church then became, the simplicity of that moment. And it's that kind of freedom that I think the Lord is calling us to in this whole thing of distraction, that it is not that we would be free from distraction in order that we could necessarily sit for like 8 hours a day in deep, silent prayer. It's that we would be free to be distracted, free from distraction, so that we are free to enjoy this life that God has given us, that we are free to enjoy this day that the Lord has made and blessed us with, that we would be free to be open to Him, to the opportunities He brings us, the ways that He wants to bless us, the ways that He's got for us to partner with Him. So then, back to Martha. And in Martha's distraction, in her pulling away, Jesus points her to her sister. And he says this, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, and indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. What had Mary chosen? Well, we read it earlier, that she had chosen to sit at Jesus' feet. And what we can think is that in that moment, while Martha's busy clanging the pots and pans passive-aggressively in the kitchen, that she had chosen this quiet time, maybe pulled out her guitar and just sang him a love song. But that's a skewed image of what was going on right there. What Mary had chosen was actually audacious. It was shocking. It was radical, because she had chosen to assume the posture of a disciple before a rabbi, a posture that was ordinarily reserved for men. Rabbis only had male disciples, and these disciples would sit at their feet and they would learn in order to pass on the teachings of the rabbi. And Mary somehow knew that she was invited to this, that she could assume that role, and she sat there and learned from him, and Jesus loved it. He could have said, oh, you should be in there too. You should be looking after me. You should have been taking care of my physical needs. That's not what he loved. And what he loved is that she chose that. And we can miss, as we read the Gospels, through our current, our eyes that know this culture and this age so well, we can miss how incredibly honoring of women Jesus was. How he constantly and consistently drew them close, allowed them into his inner circle, honored them, raised them up. And in this moment, he said, look what she's chosen. This radical thing, this almost rebellious thing, she has chosen it, and I love it, and it will not be taken from her. I am not sending this woman back to the kitchen. She saw an opportunity, and she took it, and he loved it. And for us, a life lived wholly available to God is no less radical. This life that he calls us to, it's wholehearted. It's all in. It's wholly available to him. There's nothing tame about it. He sits in the room of our lives and he invites us to be sold out, to not be so distracted doing the oughts of the day. And we all have plenty oughts of the day, that not so distracted with what we think we should be doing that we miss what he is doing. Mary, she sat and she learned from Jesus, and we can do exactly the same. That we can look at his life in the Gospels and begin to learn from him and see that in him there was one who was never once distracted. What we see in the Gospels is a man full of vision and purpose. And as I said earlier in our reading, that Jesus, he was on his way somewhere. And we know where he was going. We know that he was going to Jerusalem because it says in Luke 9:51, it's the chapter before we read, it says that at that point, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And in other translations, it says that he was determined in the way that he set out for Jerusalem. And if you want to know what a resolute setting out looks like, then find yourself in an airport with Mike. Mike is usually, you've seen him, a fairly laid back, his pace of walking is slow-ish until he gets to an airport. And then he marches. He's got his wheelie case and he like this through the airport, and all the rest of us, just normal people, are like running along behind him because he's focused on where he's going. And until he gets to the gates, he will not deviate. There is no stopping for the loo or a quick trip to duty free or whatever. He's going straight there. That's Jesus. He was resolute, but unlike Mike in that moment, he was resolute, but he was not rigid. He was focused in the way that he set out for Jerusalem. And what was waiting for him in Jerusalem? It was the cross. The place of unimaginable, unspeakable pain and suffering. He was resolute in heading to that place, in choosing that place, because that was where he was going to win our freedom. That was where he was going to bring us into eternal, unbroken relationship with the Father. That was where he was going to bear the weight of our sin, our pain, our shame. And he was headed there no matter what. He was completely focused. But in his focus, there wasn't a rigidity. It says, we just read in this story about Mary and Martha, that while he's on the way to the cross, while he's on the way, he stops in Mary and Martha's home. And in fact, in the book of Luke, 17 times it mentions Jesus being on the way. On the way to the cross, he stops and he heals. On the way, he has a conversation with someone. On the way, he preaches the kingdom. On the way, he demonstrates with power the kingdom. On the way. So there's this focus, but there's also this openness. He's prepared to be interrupted, even though he's never once distracted. And I want to understand more of how he did that. That somehow, how he lived in this way where he wasn't once thrown off course. Not thrown off course by what the people were saying to him about what kind of Messiah he should be, and they all had their opinions. That he wasn't distracted even by his own pain or fear in Gethsemane. He wasn't distracted by the overwhelming needs of the people around him. None of those things were enough to throw him off course. He was a man of both freedom and focus. And I believe that's what he has actually for all of us, for you and me, that we could live lives of both freedom and focus. And Jesus is our best example in everything. So what I thought would be good to do is just look a little bit more at his life. How did he manage to hold the two? And how could we learn to do that as well? That we would live focused and free, open to interruptions, but not distracted. Well, there's a few things that I think that we can learn from Jesus on this whole subject. And the first one is that he knew what he was called to. I've already said that he knew he was headed to the cross. The cross was the mission that he sat under. It was the banner over his whole life. He set his sails in that direction, and nothing pulled him off course. And so then the question for our lives is, do we know where we're headed? Do we know our purpose? And as God's people, we have a common purpose. And that is to live in his love and his forgiveness and his freedom. It's that we would learn to lay down our lives, that we would allow his Holy Spirit to transform us into his likeness. There is this purpose that sits over all of our lives, but within that, there's things that are specific to us. Sometimes big and obvious and tangible things, and sometimes less so. As part of God speaking to me about distraction, one of the things that he's been reminding me is, Ali, I created you to encourage. That's one of the banners over my life. And I know that. I know that that's one of the things that he has for me, is that I would see things in people and I would speak it out. I would reflect it back to them. This is who you are. This is what you do so well. And what has happened is that often, because my head is busy, I think encouraging things, but I forget to say encouraging things. And the Lord has just really gently been reminding me recently, come on, Ali, this is part of who you are. And so I'm trying to remember that again. I'm asking the Lord to remind me of that. I've written it on the wallpaper of my phone so that when I do pick my phone up, at least there's that to remind me. And what that means is any opportunity that I have to encourage someone, it's not an interruption. It's part of me living out my purpose. And I was speaking to a friend of mine a few months ago, and this friend has always known, for as long as I've known her, she's known that she is called to adoption, that she really wants to and knows that she's called to adopt. And she said to me, Ali, I can't get to heaven having not done this. And what she was meaning by that was not if I get to heaven and I've not done it, that there'll be punishment or disapproval. What she's saying is, this is so core to who I am and the call that is on my life. I cannot deviate from this. I cannot be distracted. So what is it for you? Have you asked the question of the Lord, God, what is the banner that you write over my life? What is the purpose that you have for me? What are the ways, the distinctive ways that you want me to serve you? If we know what we're called to, we can head in that direction no matter what is happening. Jesus did that perfectly. Another thing that Jesus did is, if he knew this big picture over his life, of the banner of the cross, he looked to the Father for the day-to-day details. He said of himself, it's in John 5, that the Son can only do what he sees the Father doing. And we see this relationship that Jesus had with the Father that was about him saying, okay, this is where I'm heading, but Father, what are we up to today? What is it? Who are the people? Who would you have me notice? Where is it that you're at work? How do I get involved in this? And this meant that when he was on the way to the cross, he was open to those interruptions because they were part of God's plan for that day. And so often for us, we're so fixed on the oughts, back to Martha, we're so fixed on what we think the day should hold that we miss instead those unique opportunities that God has for us. And that little line that Jesus says to Martha, 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 you are worried and upset about many things. I don't know about you, but that's me. So often I am worried, I am thinking about so many things. I love what he says next, but few things are needed. You know, there's so often in our lives, there's so many things, but God says, if you just listen to me for today, you'll find that there's only a few things that are needed. And if you tune in, if you listen to me, I'll show you what those few things are needed. Those few things are. I'll show you what the indeed only one thing is for today. And Jesus did that. He was in that relationship with the Father. And we can too. Father, help me notice what's going on today. Help me notice where you're at work. And as part of that, so Jesus had the big picture. He looked to the Father for the detail. And so this next thing, it's no surprise that he regularly chose aloneness. That was how he heard from the Father. He regularly chose to withdraw, And in fact, I find it interesting that in the Gospels, the way that it describes this withdrawal, it says that Jesus withdrew to lonely places. I find it so interesting that the Gospels give us that word. Because for us, loneliness is not something that you choose. We have very negative connotations over that. But Jesus proactively chose the lonely place. And in fact, as the cross gets nearer and nearer, Jesus withdraws more and more. Right when people needed him the most, right when the crowds were swelling, when all these people were flocking to him to hear from him and to take what they needed from him, as they needed him, so Jesus chose this withdrawal, that he chose to be radically unavailable to people in order to be available to God. Which seems crazy. He's the Savior of the world. The need was great. And it seems just as crazy now, where we think that we're the Savior of our worlds, that we would choose to be unavailable to people. We don't know what this word unavailable is anymore. We are always contactable, always at the end of a text message or an email, and we hear the beep on our phone and we feel like we should immediately pick it up. That we're always plugged into what each other's doing. If we're not present with each other physically, there's social media that keeps us informed of what each other's doing, and we are always available to one another. And if we ever choose not to be, then the fear rises up in us of missing out. FOMO is a thing. And the idea of us choosing proactively to step back from that availability in order to be available to God, it's scary. We've lost the art of doing it. And yet, Jesus needed it, and we certainly do. Because the trouble is, when we're constantly busy, we lose touch with the Father. We even lose touch with what's going on in our own hearts. And if you went now with a glass and you found a stream, maybe the one that was running through your tent yesterday, and you scooped up a glass of water and you set it to one side, what you would see is that water would be murky, full of loads of little bits of dirt and silt flying about. But if you left that glass of water to one side, just for a couple of moments, the law of gravity would kick in. And all that dirt flying about, it would begin to settle, and the water would become clear again. And for us, as we choose to withdraw, as we choose to be unavailable to others, what happens is all the stuff that is kicked up in our lives through this constant motion of busyness, as we choose stillness before a Father who loves us, the law of spiritual gravity kicks in. Things begin to settle. The Lord begins to speak. We see clearly again who he is and how he loves us. We begin to understand the things that have been pulling us away and distracting us, and that peace comes. When was the last time that we chose to be radically unavailable to other people in order that we would be available to God? Another thing that we can learn from Jesus is that Jesus recognized that he had an enemy who would try to distract him from his purpose. And we read this in Matthew 16. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and said, "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." And in that moment, Jesus recognizes Satan behind Peter's kindness. Peter, out of his love for Jesus and his compassion, is like, "That sounds horrendous. I don't like the plan that you have for your life." And even as he says it, Jesus recognizes, because he was alert to the schemes of the enemy, that the enemy was out to distract him from the purpose that was written over his life. And in that moment, as he rebukes those words, he says, "You are not going to do it. You are not going to throw me off course. You are not going to cause me to take my eyes off the cross." And we have an enemy who will use whatever he can to take our eyes off the main thing. He will use whatever he can to distract us from intimacy with Jesus and a life lived fully sold out for him. He will use our fears. He will use our pain. He will use our insecurity. He will use our busyness. He will use our phones, anything that he can to distract us. And Hebrews 12 calls us to throw off everything that hinders, to be ruthless with that stuff that would get in the way. Anything that pulls us aside that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Peter's compassion was not a bad thing, but Jesus knew what was behind it. And these things that take up our time and our attention, they're not necessarily bad things. Martha's desire to host was not a bad thing, but it was not the thing for right then. Anything that pulls us aside, it's time to throw them off. And are we prepared to be ruthless in throwing them off and casting them aside? Whether it is our phones or our fears, what are the things that hinder us from living a life of freedom in Jesus? Today is a good day to begin to cast those things aside. And the final thing that I think we can learn from the life of Jesus when it comes to distraction is he got his friends involved. Now for Jesus, it didn't go very well. We just read that, that he's like, hey friends, gather round, want to just fill you in on the plan for my life. It's unimaginable suffering. And so that didn't go so well because his friends were constantly like, no, we don't like that. We don't think that is a good thing. Hopefully, and I do think this, it will go better for us if we get our friends involved. Do we have just one or two people in our lives who know what it is that we think we're for, what the purpose is? Do we have a couple of friends that know the things that are likely to pull us aside and to distract us? I've got a few friends like that in my life, and two of those friends I'm in a little prayer group with, prayer triplet, because there's three of us. And we use an app on our phone called Marco Polo to be in touch with each other, even when we can't see each other. And we use that as a place to say, hey, this is what's going on in my life today, pray for me, and also just to fill each other in on pretty much everything. And in fact, sometimes if I'm near my husband, he's like, are you still on Marco Polo? How much can you women talk? Which I don't think is a general thing about women, but certainly for me. But I was going to a meeting a couple of months ago, and as I was heading to this meeting, I was feeling all kinds of insecurity. I just didn't want to go. And so I jumped on Marco Polo, and I just said to Liza and Karen, I was like, I don't want to do this, and I'm feeling this, and I'm feeling that. And they, within minutes, they were back on there, and in their different ways, saying, come on, Ali, you're called to this. Come on, don't give in to that insecurity. We're cheering you on. We're praying for you. They know the things in my life. They know what I'm for. They know the things that are likely to trip me up. And they champion me, and they encourage me, and I hope I do the same for them. Do you have one or two people in your life that you could trust enough to say, this is the banner written over my life? These are the things likely to pull me aside. Stand with me in it, and then do the same for them. Jesus knew what he was called to. He looked to the Father. He regularly chose to be unavailable to other people. He recognized he had an enemy that was seeking to distract him, and he got his friends involved. Going back to Martha just really briefly, one of the things that I love, one of the things that she did really right, even in the midst of her frustration, is that at least she turned to Jesus and said, help me. This is driving me mad, help me. And we need to make sure that we do the same, that we know that in our distraction, there's this brilliant verse in Lamentations 3 that talks about, well, I'll read it to you. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And he's so faithful to us. He's so kind that he's not frustrated with our distraction. He always invites us to a better way. He always invites us into an everyday, come back into my mercy, come back into my faithfulness. And if we recognize today that we have been living lives of distraction, where we have been allowing things to pull us off course, or we've been choosing things that would cause us to take our eyes off what God is doing today, we just simply need to say, I'm sorry, and we need to receive his forgiveness and the fresh start that is today and say, Jesus, help me. Help me live a life fully available to you. Help me to live a life of focus on you and what you have for me and the things that you're doing. But also, God, help me live a life of freedom. Every day, present to what it is you're saying, present to what you're doing and what you want to do in and through me, free from distraction. Amen.